War and Revolution. Section. Historical Revisionism, Neoliberalism, and Anti-Colonial Revolution. Thierret's judgment of the anti-colonial revolution is not very different from that of the two German authors. According to him, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Castro, Guevara, and later Ortega, the hero of the Sandinista in Nicaragua, are not actors in major movements that have changed the face of the world, but bizarre cult objects of an exotic fanaticism. Here we have a further point of convergence between historical revisionism and neoliberalism. An explicit rehabilitation of colonialism is ventured by the theoretician of the open society himself. Popper seems to offer an unequivocally positive assessment of the centuries-long domination of the rest of humanity by the great European and Western powers. Quote, "We freed these states too quickly and too simplistically." End quote. The years when Arendt denounced the policy of genocide implemented by colonialism, in the Congo for example, and identified colonial domination as the initial laboratory of totalitarian regimes, seems far off. To formulate his condemnation of anti-colonial revolutions, Paul Johnson employs the category applied by historical revisionism to other revolutions. Quote, "Abandonment of the royal road of gradualism, or, in this instance, a gradualist approach to self-rule." Once again, the rupture and the introduction of superfluous, disastrous violence are attributable to the revolutionary intellectual, quote, "the religious fanatic reincarnated as professional politician, who, in this instance, too proved himself, quote, the great destructive force of the 20th century. In the revolution in Russia, as in the colonies or ex-colonies, we find the same intellectual and political strata in action. Beginning of long quote. Lenin's Bolsheviks of 1917, Mao's CCP cadres of 1949, and the congressmen of India came to power by different routes. But they had this in common. All three new ruling groups were men who had never engaged in any other occupation except politics, and had devoted their lives to the exploitation of a flexible concept called democracy. End quote. The contiguity of revolution and Nazism is even apparent in seemingly moderate anti-colonial movements. Gandhi, quote, "was a year older than Lenin, with whom he shared a quasi-religious approach to politics, though in sheer crankiness he had much more in common with Hitler, his junior by 20 years. End quote. Now, after the catastrophe, there is no alternative in, quote, "a great many third-world countries to the revival of colonialism. Indeed, an altruistic revival of colonialism. There is a moral issue here. The civilized world has a mission to go out to these desperate places and govern." End quote. According to Johnson, intervention is required not only in countries that are incapable of self-government, but also in those self-governing countries which display a tendency to extremism. Reagan was right to interfere in Grenada and overthrow its government. Even more important than the directly political positions adopted by it is the historical balance sheet that emerges from revisionist historiography. To a certain extent, colonial expansion was a reluctant and involuntary process, initiated with the voyages undertaken at the dawn of the modern age by Dutch, Portuguese, and British merchants, who landed on the coasts of Africa in search of business. Not so much as a vague reference to the slave trade. This enormous instance of repression is starkly apparent in the assertion that, with the Pale of Settlement imposed on Jews in Tsarist Russia, we have, quote, "the first modern exercise in social engineering, treating human beings, in this case Jews, as earth or concrete to be shoveled around." End quote. In reality, on the basis of the definition of social engineering offered here, it should be said that a key chapter in its history was the history of the domination of colonial populations. In fact, were account to be taken of the slave trade and the deportation of Native Americans, the U.S. would turn out to be the architect of the most colossal experiments in social engineering. The rehabilitation of colonialism and the repression of its most tragic aspects also cast a shadow over the abolitionist revolution. In a familiar argument, revisionist historiography condemns it for interrupting a process of the gradual extinction of slavery, already in train, with Jacobin frenzy and superfluous violence. While liberal literature seems to ignore that revolution because it erases the ensuing tragedy from the historical record. This explains the habitual celebration of Calhoun as a strong individualist. But can such a definition be regarded as accurate in the case of an author who denied an individual character to blacks, who were condemned by him to perpetual slavery and degraded to the status of mere work tools? On other occasions, Calhoun is promoted to the rank of, quote, defender of minority rights against the abuse of an overbearing majority, end quote, to the status of a theoretician of the moderation and self-limitation that should typify majorities. What is forgotten is that his appeal to the majority for moderation was an appeal to central power not to interfere in the peculiar institution, which involved the white master's absolute, unbounded power over black slaves. Repression of the colonial question makes it impossible to understand the Second 30 Years' War adequately. We have noted Furet's thesis that the crimes, quote, perpetrated in the name of the proletarian revolution in the Soviet Union far exceeded those of the Third Reich, quote, until 1941. Let us linger for a moment over this comparison between two political movements, one of which gave impetus to the process of decolonization, while the other was committed to containing and repulsing the inferior races, and to reviving the colonial tradition in Europe itself. Yet the contrast is made with the eve of Operation Barbarossa as its basis, as if the plans for colonial expansion into Eastern Europe, already heralded by Mein Kampf, could be expunged from Nazism. For the purposes of condemning the French Revolution, it is uncoupled from the abolition of slavery effected in the colonies and contrasted with an American Revolution, wherein the fate of blacks and Native Americans has been repressed. To liquidate the proletarian revolution, the French historian first disconnects it from the anti-colonial movement which promoted and then contrasts it with the Third Reich that he would like to purge of the colonial war of extermination. We have seen Hitler comparing the natives of Eastern Europe to the Redskins of the Far West. Revisionist historiography impartially neglects both. So deep-rooted and self-evident is the exclusion of the barbarians from the historical picture that Furet dates the start of the Second World War from the 3rd of September 1939. Not only are China, Ethiopia, and so forth not taken into account, nor is Poland, invaded 2 days earlier. The Second World War began with Britain and France's declaration of war on Germany, that is, with the struggle between the Western great powers. Repression of the colonial question and revisionist condemnation of the anti-colonial revolution sets off a chain reaction. Why should we continue to regard Churchill as a hero of world history if, by dint of his anti-German intransigence, he ended up putting the colonial empire he sought to defend, and whose retention had been guaranteed by Hitler, into liquidation? Would it not have been preferable to come to an arrangement with Germany, conceding it the colonial empire to which it too aspired? The fact is that, by erasing the colonial and national question, repressing the desperate resistance of the natives of Eastern Europe and undermen in general, and further repressing the struggle against any imperial race that developed in the colonies in the wake of the master race's defeat, it becomes impossible to understand the great democratic, emancipatory significance of the Second World War. The outbreak of the dreadful conflict could supposedly have been avoided by timely colonial concessions to Japan, Italy, and Germany. Thus argue prominent representatives of American revisionism. Because of its population growth, the land of the rising sun required its own area of expansion. Promoting the spread of capitalism and civilization in Asia, it played a positive role and, in any event, formed a bulwark against the Soviet threat. Manchuria had never really been an integral part of China. Japan merely aspired to an Asian Monroe Doctrine and to establish over a region crucial to its national security and economic space a control analogous to that exercised over Mexico by the USA. In both cases, the feelings of the population or local politicians cannot be taken into account. Ethiopia harbored an aggressive attitude towards the African colonies of Italy, which needed to extend its territorial domains to find an outlet for a colossal flow of immigrants, whose access to the United States and other countries was denied or impeded by restrictive laws. As regards the Third Reich, even sectors of British diplomacy acknowledged the reasonableness of its request for the colonies lost at Versailles to be restored to it. Hitler even displayed a spirit of conciliation over Eastern Europe, making proposals which, on the very eve of war, proved, quote, surprisingly moderate. It was Stalin who sowed discord and incited war between the capitalist countries. Instead of encouraging a regional compromise, the USA proclaimed, quote, a crusade against aggressor nations, and unleashed economic warfare, first against Italy and then against Japan. It thereby played into the hands of the USSR, which encouraged China and Ethiopia in their intransigence and waved the banner of anti-colonialism in order to weaken capitalist enemies by turning them against one another. It is no accident if the U.S. historian Tansel, cited at some length here, ended his days engaged in the struggle against the Second Reconstruction and defending racial segregation. The rehabilitation of colonialism, or repression of the colonial question, betokens the triumph of historical revisionism. On the other hand, interpreting the Second World War in accordance with the Entente's schema of democratic interventionism means legitimizing the idea of crusades and exporting revolution, which historical revisionism denounces in Jacobinism and Bolshevism. And if the interpretation of the First World War as a crusade for democracy is rendered problematic or absurd by the presence in the anti-German alliance of Tsarist Russia or Imperial Japan, interpretation of the Second World War in that key proves even less credible, given the alliance of the Western powers with the Soviet Union decidedly worse, according to historical revisionists, than the Third Reich itself. End section.